I'd like to acknowledge, first of all, the charge d'affaires of the U.S. Embassy, Jessie Lapen, and I'm very glad that I speak after her, in particular because I'm sure she would know that many of us around the continent have been very concerned to understand what the government of the U.S. inaugurated in January this year, what its position would be towards the African continent. And I'm sure you'll understand why there was that concern. There's been that concern around the continent. I'm very, very glad indeed with what she said just now about the meeting that Secretary Tillerson had with his African representatives recently in Washington. And I think that positive message would be of help, both to the continent and to this country in particular. But thank you very much, indeed, Jesse, for your comments. As the chairperson, as Zianda has just said, I'll speak to the same topic that she was given there, which was South Africa living up to its promise. And more than a decade ago, we were honored as the South African government to host for a few days a leading representative of the then government of Austria. And at that moment, our democracy was less than 10 years old and continued to attract considerable attention throughout the world. And accordingly, we had to engage our Austrian guest in a detailed discussion about our programs to respond to our national challenges. And our guest left us with an observation which many of us never forgot. Simply, he said that in the international context, South Africa was a pilot project. And in this regard, he picked out two matters. And these were first what we were doing to build a truly non-racial society, and therefore successfully to manage a diverse society. And secondly, what we were doing to eradicate poverty, and in that context to reduce the gross racial and gender socioeconomic inequalities which our democracy had inherited. And our guest insisted that even Austria faced similar challenges of managing the management of a diverse society and the reduction of socioeconomic inequalities, obviously on a much smaller scale than South Africa. He therefore informed us that because of this, the broad Austrian leadership was doing its best to watch how our country was responding to these challenges and was greatly encouraged that we were successfully serving as a pilot project even for his country. I've told you this story because of the subject I've been asked to address, which is South Africa living up to its promise. And I've read this to mean that certainly the organizers of this important conference believe that South Africa has not lived up to its promise. And in this regard, let me hasten to say that I fully agree with this sentiment, that indeed democratic South Africa has not fully lived up to that promise. And what were the elements of that promise? I believe that our Austrian guest was correct when he said that our country held out the promise of the successful management of a racially diverse society, leading to the building of a truly non-racial country. And related to this was the promise that it would entrench democracy in our country in a manner which would ensure the building of the necessary institutions, respect for human rights, and the rule of law. And our country also held out the promise of radically reducing poverty in the country and reducing the yawning racial and gender inequalities in terms of the distribution of wealth and income, thus to accomplish the goal of a better life for all. In this context, it held out the promise that it would build an economy which would grow and develop at significant rates, sufficient for it to generate the new wealth on a sustainable basis, the new wealth which is required to achieve the progressive socio-economic objectives I have mentioned. and with the strongest and most developed economy on our continent, and the value system that historically characterized our national liberation movement, certainly as represented by the governing party, the ANC, our country held out the promise that it would also serve as a living example which would contribute to dissipate the then prevalent Afro-pessimism and thus help other countries on our continent to address their challenges in a manner which would make a positive impact on the lives of the billion Africans. And this would make it possible for Africa to take its rightful place in the system of international relations, resulting, among others, in better management of Africa's resources and less dependence on the charity of the developed world of the North. It therefore stands to reason that when the assertion is made that South Africa has not lived up to its promise, the statement must be measured against the various promises I've just listed. And however, with your permission, I will not do this, as it would take a fair amount of time, which we do not have this morning. But I'd like to believe that all of us here are familiar with the fact that 3 weeks ago, the veterans and stalwarts of the ANC, our country's governing party, held what they described as a national consultative conference. And briefly, these very senior cadres of the ANC convened this conference exactly because of their very grave concern that because of various misdemeanors of the ANC as a governing party, our country was continuously moving away from delivering on the promises I've listed. And let me quote part of what the consultative conference said in the declaration it issued as it concluded its work. It said, among others, the veterans and stalwarts of the ANC said, we observe that the current elected leadership of the ANC is paralyzed and unable to deal with ill discipline, incompetence, and corruption that point directly to the highest office in the land. And it said, we further observe that Parliament and the executive, led by the President, the latter, have been found to have failed in their constitutional obligations by the highest court of the land. And the declaration said the mismanagement of our economy has led to unprecedented unemployment rates, and that this has exacerbated the levels of poverty among the masses of our people. And said we are witness to the moral degeneration in society that is overseen by a self-centered, non-caring leadership that lacks honesty, integrity, and a vision for the future. And said we are also witness to the systematic erosion of the state's ability to carry out its constitutional mandate of delivering services to the people. And then said, as well as actions by the ANC leadership, which have resulted in diminishing the stature and reputation of South Africa and the African National Congress in the eyes of our people, the sister peoples on the African continent and the world at large, unquote. Now, I believe these statements made by a most politically mature echelon of the membership of the ANC are sufficient to indicate how seriously the people of South Africa view and describe the reality that our country has failed to live up to its promise, and therefore their urgent desire to move away from this negative reality. In any case, and in addition, all of us are familiar with the negative assessment of the rating of South Africa, which has been made by the international rating agencies, consistent with the views expressed even by the oldest of the members of the ANC. Thus, we must come back to the question that what must be done to ensure that South Africa lives up to its historic promise. Of course, immanent in that very question is a suggestion that it is in fact possible to achieve the objective of ensuring that our country lives up to its promise. My comments with regard to the matters I have just raised are therefore that first, it is indeed possible to ensure that our country lives up to its promise. And secondly, to achieve this outcome, it will be important that the country is mobilized to act in unity to achieve the nationally agreed objectives as stated in our Constitution of building a non-racial and non-sexist and democratic and prosperous society committed to addressing the grievances of the past. And third, our starting point must be that the members of the ANC, that's the governing party, again I must insist, supported by the rest of our population, must act firmly and on a sustained basis to ensure that the ANC seriously addresses its weaknesses and misdemeanors so that it honestly discharges its responsibilities in the context of the constitutional objectives I have just mentioned. And I mention specifically the ANC because all indications suggest that it will continue to enjoy primacy as the governing party of choice, or at least the single largest party in terms of how our population will vote during our national elections, the next of which are due, as you know, in 2019. And fourth, it is vitally important that the masses of the people of South Africa are mobilized, as happened during the difficult years of struggle against apartheid, once more to adopt the posture that they are their own liberators, determined to ensure that South Africa develops into the country for which they fought and sacrificed. The question arises naturally as to whether all what I've just said does not amount to nothing more than a pipe dream, the mere expression of an unrealizable wish. In this view, I'd like to state my very firm views. The first of these, once again, is that it is indeed eminently possible to ensure that sooner rather than later, South Africa returns to the path according to which it would live up to its promise, as we defined this earlier. And I make this firm assertion exactly because as our people have done everything to defend and entrench our democratic system, so does the possibility exist that precisely because of the vibrancy of our democracy, our people have the possibility, which they will exercise, to ensure that our country and theirs lives up to its promise. Put simply, it is through the exercise of their democratic rights by our people that it will be possible for the country correctly to respond to the concerns raised by the ANC veterans and stalwarts at the National Consultative Conference. In other words, the South African people must and will use the effect of the democratic gains they made through struggle to use their democratic power to defeat the negative elements which have taken control of the governing party, the ANC, including as this relates to the reprehensible phenomenon of state capture. Already our judiciary, and more recently the national legislature, acting within their constitutional mandates, have demonstrated how our democratic constitutional system can and must respond to all efforts to negate what our Constitution says, which has resulted in our country failing to live up to its promise. And it remains for all the South African patriotic forces to ensure that all other sections of our population act in a manner consistent with what the judiciary and the national legislature have done, thus to generate the popular power to ensure that our country repositions itself again to live up to its promise. An important part of what this will require will be that broad and united democratic response to ensure that South Africa lives up to this promise also addresses various matters of political, economic, social, international, and other policy. When the ANC acceded to power in 1994, its policies as a governing party were informed by two strategic policy documents. These were the documents Ready to Govern and the Reconstruction and Development Program. And obviously, after 1994, the ANC elaborated other policy documents, among others to respond to challenges which had come up during the process of governance, but which did not depart from the fundamental propositions in the Ready to Govern and RDP documents. And here I refer to such other documents as one called the State and Social Transformation, and another called Growth, Employment and Redistribution, a macroeconomic strategy called GEAR, as well as a big complex of documented decisions taken by government effectively to give effect to all the documents and policies I've mentioned. I say all of this to make the important point that since 1994, our democratic order has taken a multiplicity of decisions exactly to spell out in detail what democratic South Africa must do to live up to its promise. In this context, I'd like to make the observation that one of the weaknesses of the National Development Plan is that, which was adopted in this country a couple of years back, is that it completely fails to assess the government's policies which preceded that NDP, National Development Plan, including whether these correctly identified what had to be done to address our country's historic challenge of the eradication of the legacy of colonialism and apartheid. And the central point I'd like to make is that when success is achieved with regard to addressing the negative challenges facing the governing party, that is the ANC, it will be possible to attend to such important matters as elaborating a program of action to implement the National Development Plan, that's the NDP, which implementation must, among others, result in achieving the objectives indicated in the plan, such as high economic growth rates, significant poverty reduction, and meaningful and sustained job creation. It will be possible to address such matters as ensuring that the state and the state-owned enterprises, a matter that Jesse Lapen has just referred to, ensuring that its state and the state-owned enterprises play their proper role in terms of contributing to the implementation of the NDP, freed from the corrosive clutches of corruption. It would also be possible to ensure the proper functioning of our constitutional democracy, consistent with the manner in which our Constitutional Court explained what our Constitution expects of all our governance institutions. This would include restoring to their full health all the state institutions which have been corrupted and weakened, especially during the last decade. It also would mean the strengthening of the partnership between the government, the corporate sector, the trade unions, and civil society to ensure the achievement of the goal of a better life for all as indicated in the National Development Plan. And it would make possible the activation of the criminal justice system to discharge its responsibilities with regard to stamping out corruption, including its manifestation as state capture, thus to help ensure that our people as a whole, whatever their social status, practically respect the principle and the practice of the rule of law. To conclude, I'm therefore saying that yes, South Africa will once again live up to its promise, confirming their decision to act rather than stand and watch. In their declaration, the ANC stalwarts and veterans said, and I quote, "We acknowledge that our failure to address the negative developments emanating from ANC misdemeanors, our failure to act timeously, has contributed towards the grave reputational damage, the political and moral crisis facing our organization and country," unquote. As we meet here in Cape Town, a mere 10 days before the start of the 54th National Conference of the ANC, again to which the U.S. Chargé d'Affaires referred, millions throughout our country are engaged in various actions specifically to end the grave reputational damage, the political and moral crisis facing our organization and country, to which the ANC stalwarts and veterans referred. And I'm certain that in the last decade has taught these millions in our country the lesson that directly in their own interest, they must act to ensure that South Africa does indeed live up to its promise. And thank you very much for your attention.